Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Sally Kenney. Sally is an educational and developmental psychologist who specialises in working with children and adolescents. She holds a master's degree in educational psychology, is a member of the Australian Psychological Society, a fellow of the College of Educational and Developmental Psychologists, and a member of the APS Psychologists in Schools interest group. Sally has over 16 years of experience working in schools and has supported students with a wide range of learning, social and emotional challenges. It's been a pleasure to speak with Sally today about all things psychology related in schools and also wider with regards to the need for psychology in the community, in schools, and also in supporting staff within schools as well. I hope you really enjoy this episode, as I did immensely speaking with Sally. Sally, a big thank you for coming on to the show today.
No problems. Thanks for having me.
As you know, one of my passions is getting guests on to talk about their passions. It tends to be a format that works really well for us to learn about people in their industry. You know, obviously our world is psychology. There are special interests that we have. There are passions that we have. There's things that we are value driven around, and so I extend that out to you as well, and I'm excited to have this conversation today to find out more about you and your passions.
Yeah. Well, I am speaking to you from school at the moment, so you'll hear all sorts of noises and bells and emails popping in every now and then, so I apologise in advance, but I love being here. I absolutely, really passionate about working in education. I'm so fortunate I get to work in a K-12 school down here in Melbourne, and if any given day I can be observing 3-year-olds in the ELC or talking to 18-year-olds in Year 12 across my day in terms of interactions with students, working with teachers, parents, leadership. It's such a beautiful, varied role. So it doesn't get boring. It's never stale. It's very, very busy, as you could probably imagine, but really diverse. And so I think it gives me an opportunity to really use a lot of my skills as a psychologist across a range of contexts in one place. Yeah, I love it.
Fantastic. And how many students are at your school?
810-ish. Yeah, so it's quite small. We have in our senior school, so anywhere between 80 and 100 in a year level. So you do get to know the students really well, which is, it's really nice for them. It's nice for us. So on the small side, as far as schools go, I've worked in other schools, 2,500. This is, it's nice, comfy. Yeah.
That's incredible, because when you first said 800, I felt the weight of that, saying, "My goodness, that's a lot of bodies to be aware of, and to potentially see throughout the day or year as it goes, or their journey." But then when you say 2,500, wow, that's a big difference. How does it work in that space? Obviously, not all of our listeners have been exposed to what it looks like to be a school counsellor, psychologist. Yeah. Can you talk us through a little bit about the role, what that looks like, and obviously, that might be quite different from 800 or 2,500, because I imagine what you end up doing on the ground is different if you're looking after 2,500 versus 800.
Yeah, that's right. And look, obviously the nuts and bolts of the role is always going to be that, direct child support, so working individually with students. I'd probably be about maybe 70% of the time that's what we're doing. I have a colleague as well, so I'm not here by myself. I was the only psychologist for a while, but I have another psychologist who works with me a few days a week too, which is an absolute treat because she's a gem, and we get to work together because, it can be quite challenging when you're the only person who does what you do in the school. So yeah, a lot of that one-on-one student counselling sort of work. There's a lot of sort of making sure within that we're organising referrals to other organisations and professionals in the community where needed. So there are some students who come to see us once or twice, and we arrange for them to have their needs met in a more appropriate setting. But then we will work with those external professionals as well. So there's a lot of that consultation part of the role. We do some advising on policies and procedures and what happens there. I get quite involved in child safe standards implementation and child protection policies and that kind of thing. We support curriculums, designing curriculum and programs. We do staff professional development. We work with parents, presentations for parents or organising. I'm so lucky here. I get to work really closely with our marketing department, and we have a range of different speakers that come in. But that's informed from our work with the students and with the discussions with parents to sort of say, well, what are the issues that parents, want to find out more about, and then help source good speakers for that. That's kind of, I do a little bit of all of that probably within the course of most days.
It's very varied and broad.
Yeah. And look, I've worked in other contexts where it's not like that, where it is basically just one after the other individual counselling, which, obviously the need's always there. But I find this part of the role really, really satisfying to be able to, get your teeth in, because really our role as psychologists into schools is that we're working with schools to create an environment where good mental health and flourishing can happen. And there's so many ways that we can impact that, bringing our psychology skills beyond just individual students with difficulties. We can contribute right across the board. And we, when we find schools like the one that I'm in that understand that and they want you to do that and help, create that flourishing environment, it's just really satisfying.
That's one of the most exciting things as a psychologist that I see, is where we find environments that are open, willing, or able to see the value that a psychologist can bring to have a psychological perspective as to, how do we bring a nourishing environment forward rather than just doing crisis work, for example. They're poles apart. They're both in great need, and one's not more important than the other. But I think equally they have, really significant roles to play. So it sounds like it's a lovely environment that you're in at the moment, to be able to look at everything from policy or professional development through to the one-on-one with your students, and I'm assuming parents as well.
Yeah. And it all integrates and links in somewhere. I think that's, no part of the role is sort of done in isolation from the other parts. And I think that's where you can be the most impactful, is when, a lot of what we do in psychology in general, particularly with young people, is psychoeducation. And there's so many ways that we can deliver that when we're in a school context. We can deliver it one-on-one. We can do it in year-level assemblies. We can do it in presentations. We can do it to train staff to understand that, so that they can support students, or parents to be able to support their children. Because a lot of what the one-on-one counselling, a lot of that sits at that subclinical level. And we do have a lot of students present with issues that we can help them sort of work through without it needing to be, a referral that goes out into the community, where the wait lists are pretty crazy at the moment. Actually, it's quite disheartening how long it can take. But what we're hoping to do in that preventative model is to equip the students with those skills when they first start to experience some discomfort or distress, and help them not get to that point. That's something that I think in schools we do really, really well. It's hard to measure because you never know what you've prevented. There's no metric around that. So you do kind of hope that what you're doing is helpful. But I think having psychologists in school to support some of those early developing issues, if that takes some of the pressure off that community sector, that's really important for us to be able to do that. But it involves work and us bringing our knowledge of psychology, of human behaviour, of systems, of relationships, and bringing that in and integrating that at all levels in the system, not just at that point of distress.
It's a really good point that you bring forward, and I know that it's always hard to measure what's the affect, and clearly we know there's an immense value in having those support networks, particularly that psychology brings in a school. It's just difficult to measure. The only measure we would really probably do is to remove psychologists out and see what happens. That might be, problematic. But as you say, the other big picture is ensuring that support is there, so it remains in that subclinical space, and it doesn't require a referral on, because it's already, as you mentioned, somewhat bursting at the seams. The private sector, the community sector, it's hard to go out and refer on because those waiting times can be quite significant. Is that something that you also find? I'm mindful that you're in Melbourne. I'm in Canberra,
And look, I guess one of the things that, when we get a new referral, if it does appear to us from the outset that this is in that sort of, clinical realm, we're looking at, this is likely to be a diagnosable mental health condition. This is someone who needs a targeted therapeutic intervention, which is not normally what you come to school for. We will refer those students out into the community, and they're getting that therapeutic targeted intervention outside of school. They still come to school though. And that's one of the things that we have. So we might, refer a young person who's having really debilitating panic attacks, and they're off getting some, evidence-based treatment for their panic attacks. They're still having panic attacks when they're coming to school while that treatment is taking effect. So, for us as psychologists, in working in schools, we will refer those, more challenging or higher needs cases out of a school context, but we're still managing the behaviours and that in the school context. And that's, that is quite challenging. We do, have to do quite a lot of work. So it might not be a student who's directly a client of ours, but we might, over the course of a day, spend a couple of hours working around something that's happened with them. And I can't say to a student who turns up really distressed, sorry, I referred you out, you can't come see me. And that's, so yes, we've got, I think slowly the wait lists do seem to be shortening at the moment, from what I can tell. I think we've peaked, now we're starting to find places. But, I get a little concerned sometimes about, with obviously at the moment there's a whole lot of stuff about funding and, who's doing what, federal, state, that kind of thing, and putting lots of money, tens of millions of dollars into mental health services. And I just kind of, well, who's going to work in them? Who are these mental health practitioners that you're having? Because I don't know any out-of-work psychologists. Everyone I know is working, really hard. So I think we need to make that longer term and come back into training psychologists, and actually building that workforce from the ground up. Yes, we need funding in mental health services, but we need practitioners, and we need practitioners that are functioning, that aren't burning out, which is a big issue, especially for some newer practitioners who jump straight into a a really healthy caseload and then a few months later aren't coping, we need to look at what we're doing to train our practitioners so that we do have, that capacity. But, what we're hoping in a school setting is that it's a buffer. It is stopping things getting to that point. We at the start of the year, I go into every year 7 class with my colleague and we introduce ourselves. We talk about, why is there a psychologist at your school? What do we help with? How do you come see us? And I always say to the students, don't wait to see how much worse you can get. If you're needing some help now, come and see one of us now. Don't wait and see if it's going to get worse if it doesn't have to. And we really push that point with the young people, because a lot of the time all they need is just a couple of conversations, contextualise what's going on, normalise it. Adolescence is an incredibly tumultuous time. They're trying to, I know you've had Michael Carr-Gregg on your show, and I think he talks a lot about those tasks of adolescence and all those, needs for independence. And so what we find is, for our young people, they're trying to be independent from mum and dad. It's the hardest time to tell mum and dad they're struggling, because they're trying to say all the time, I've got this, let me go. It's hard to then say, actually, I don't know what the hell I'm doing and I'm feeling really anxious, but they can come to us. And sometimes that's what they need. And if that stops it becoming a more entrenched issue that does start to move into that realm of a diagnosable mental health condition, then that's us doing our job really well.
It also speaks to your earlier point about the need for psychologists on the ground, that there is there might be funding being provided, but the question is, what do we do about this bottleneck, that there is not enough clinicians on the ground to fulfill the need? And as you say, if we do early intervention, and I know that word is, it seems to be used all the time, but I think it's because it holds so much value and merit. If we can do something early, it might just be a couple of conversations rather than, therapy over a course of a couple of years. It might be something that we can upskill, develop, even just appreciating the value of help-seeking behaviour that is then reinforced, and off we go. And so whenever we need it, we can pick up the phone and call a friend, or do it professionally through a psychologist, whatever it might be. But something needs to be reinforced rather than letting it kind of go and go and go. So there's this big question about how do we rectify or address this bottleneck? We need some more trained clinicians on the ground.
Yeah. And look, part of that, obviously, that goes back to the university, and we know that the tertiary education sector has really copped it over recent years, and, courses being cut and all that kind of thing. And, so I'm an educational developmental psychologist, so that was my master's training, and I supervise master's students doing their educational developmental psychology masters. And, there's not many of those courses around. There's, we've got a few in Victoria, there's a couple in New South Wales and one in Tassie. There's not many of them around. And trying to get more ed and devs qualified is really important, because what we bring, not just to schools, obviously schools where I work, but you'll find ed and devs across a whole range of different contexts. But trying to just, increase places for universities to train ed and devs, but also, part of that is you need people like me to supervise them, and so trying to grow the ranks of supervisors so that you've got enough supervisors there to support the placement needs, and that sort of thing. It's colleagues of mine here at school, they'll have student teachers, often during the year, and when we were talking about their experience and then my experience of supervising the students, they couldn't believe I do it for nothing, because they get paid to host a student teacher, and why do you do it for nothing? Because we need more of me. Like that's how this is happening, but that's definitely an issue. I've sort of got a position on the national committee for the College of Ed and Dev Psychologists, and one of our subgroups that I'm a part of is looking at promoting the discipline, and part of that is promoting just awareness of what it is we do, because we want there to be that demand. We need, for GPs or for paediatricians, for parents to know that actually in this case with this issue, an educational developmental psychologist is the person that you want to help you with this issue. We want parents going, oh, well, can you please refer me to an educational developmental psychologist, so that we see that value. But, you know, I think a lot of people do get stuck in that that kind of clinical conceptualization of assess, diagnose, treat. That is how they see psychology. And what we're able to do in a school setting in particular is just set that, you know, that example that that's not all psychology is. And you can be working with people outside of that clinical model and have really important outcomes rather. But I think, you know, the general public don't always necessarily understand that there is that variation within psychology as a discipline.
I can very easily make a bunch of assumptions as to why this bottleneck is there, but I actually don't factually know. You know, to me, it just seems like there's not enough eager, motivated people being given places, you know, students being given places to actually complete their training. You know, I know every year there is a application process. There's a tussle that goes on at universities of trying to get one of those elusive sort of spots that you know is so few and far between, of, you know, a large cohort of maybe, you know, 40, 50, 60, you know, smaller university trying to maybe fight for, you know, 6 to 10, 12 spots or whatever that might be. It just narrows it down, but they're all passionate. They're all have already done a postgraduate, and they're trying to do just the next couple of years so that they can do something they're passionate about. But what is the bottleneck? Is it that universities don't make money from master's students? Is there they don't have enough lecturers out there, like, because there's a quota of, you know, lecturers per student? What is it?
Yeah.
Do you have any insight as to why this is occurring? Because clearly there's people who want to do the profession and are excellent, you know, excellent candidates to do it, but not enough places.
Yeah. And look, my understanding, without knowing sort of too much in depth around the particular funding models or whatever in the university sector, is that you know, that sort of, you know, master's students are expensive for universities. You know, the master's courses are, that there is quite a lot involved in organising placements and that kind of stuff, and it is a, you know, whether it makes enough money for the universities to justify it. It's interesting because I think, you know, universities are more likely to put money into courses where there's a clearly defined linear outcome. You know, you do this course, you do that job. And in psychology, obviously, you know, there's a lot of diversity that comes out of that. But once you're getting into that, you know, in that master's kind of realm, there is a lot of work. There is a lot of work for qualified psychologists. So I don't really get it. I just, that's where I think, you know, I get frustrated when I read these articles about, you know, funding for, like, you know, the agencies need it. But like, well, hang on, why is there no funding going into universities? And obviously, you know, having extra appointments available next month in a public health service is an immediate thing, and we know that immediate outcomes are better at getting votes. I'm being really cynical there, but that's, you know, but it is a long-term investment. It takes, you know, 6 to 8 years to have, you know, from start to finish, and even then, you know, you still need a bit of life behind you before you start doing it. So yeah, look, I don't understand why, you know, from just my kind of basic perspective, why it's not valued as much. But I think, you know, training other mental health professionals, other allied health, might be quicker and cheaper.
I mean, I think that's great. Psychology has obviously grown so much. Maybe, you know, the rapid expansion of it is difficult to catch up with. Certainly, you know, I think it's extremely welcome that there are these new, you know, provisions for additional appointments, for example, under the mental health care plan, better access at the moment. Having said that, does still create a new bottleneck. It means that people who are already in the system will stay supported, and that's a good thing. That's welcome. I think the APS, guidelines would suggest best practice is to provide more therapy sessions, but it just means that there's not enough. It compounds it, because it says let's put the money into more sessions rather than money into more clinicians.
Well, and that's what happens, because then, instead of someone who gets 10 sessions in a year going once a month, suddenly they get 20, they're going once a fortnight, which is great for them, but it means whoever's next on the wait list has to wait longer. And that, we did see, I've like I said, it's starting to kind of, the wait list time seems to be shortening this is just from the students that we're referring out. But, when we were sort of that kind of second half of 2020, so many were just closing their books because no one wants to say to a prospective client, sorry, it's an 8-month wait. They're closing their wait lists. And that really did coincide with those extra sessions coming online, that suddenly you were just having to wait longer for your turn. It was really quite difficult. We had families who were, screaming out for support, really watching their children really suffer. But just, that's that sort of, the missing middle. They're not quite unwell enough for hospital, but, they're not properly, supported with a telehealth session every couple of weeks. They needed more, and it just wasn't there. So it was a really challenging time. And so we're not out of the woods yet, but it was intense.
Yeah. How does it work in the school setting? Is there a particular ratio that is being aimed for? Is it just whatever clinicians we can get on board, depending on what's available? Because I know, for example, at least here in the ACT, there have been some genuinely concerted efforts by the education department to go heavy on recruiting and trying to provide all sorts of incentives and trying to get clinicians on board. And we've seen a phase where there was a high uptake. We also then saw lower retention, and almost back in the same sort of space. And look, I can't say that with great authority, but at least speaking to my colleagues, that seems to have been something that's occurred in the ACT. Don't know if that's 100% valid, but I've heard that. I know that they're still searching. That we're all kind of fighting each other, right? I'm in private practice where we're fighting, ACT health, we're fighting the ACT education, they're fighting us. It's this whole sort of thing, the whole thing going on in terms of saying, obviously we've got a great pool of great clinicians, but we're all resource poor.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that question around ratio, the 1 to 500 in schools is, the one that comes up time and time again. My understanding is that was first kind of put out there as a name back in the late 90s, perhaps. Was an inquiry into suicide in New South Wales, and that was one of the recommendations that came up again last year. Dr. Fiona Martin chaired the parliamentary committee into mental health suicide prevention, and her recommendation again was 1 to 500 in schools, increase university places, increase diversity within the profession as well, and just to try and get in at that level of that primary prevention, early intervention level. And when you've got, 1 to 500 ratio, I think some schools might get close to that. I'm in an independent school, which is well resourced, and it's schools like these are more likely to get towards that 1 to 500 ratio. Some schools, some of the bigger schools in the less advantaged areas, they wouldn't come close. And also, what does that look like functionally? Because it's not that you see one out of one psychologist is seeing 500 students, sure. But there's all the other things. It's funny, every year when I stand there and I watch the year 12s graduate every year, and I stand at the back of the hall as they come down the middle of the aisle, and I count on my fingers as they come down how many I've seen since they were in year 7, and it's usually a quarter to a third of the year level. It's about a third of them last year, students who've come to me at some point. Now that's a third of a year level school of 800. I don't know, I'm not that good at maths, but that's actually quite a lot. A lot of
Well, what
students
that
have that one-on-one.
is it says it's beautiful. It means that the system, when it's available, gets utilised by young people who are willing and open enough to say, I'm having a hard time. I'm actually going to reach out, and I'd like to believe that need was therefore met, because when they asked for it, it was available, and that's beautiful. There's probably a large number in there as well that thought about it, they contemplated, but they still didn't take the step. But nonetheless, a quarter or a third is great, but it's frightening when you say that, because I know I've heard of our colleagues, being spread over, 2, sometimes even 3 schools. And I just scratch my head, because that effectively means, there's been a situation where there's 2 schools. That means, 3 schools. It means 2 days at one school, 2 days at another, and 1 day at a third school. What do you do in a day? I mean, the lack of continuity of care, of this purely crises. Where, how do you do inequality? It's just mind-boggling.
And when we look at, what those barriers to help seeking are in young people, obviously, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Chelsea Hyde's done some great work around that. And it's things like accessibility is obviously a big barrier. If you don't have a service that's accessible to you, now that might be about your own personal resources, that might be about wait lists, but it also might be just, if for you to get the help you need means that you need to go outside of school and engage that privately, and you're a young person who doesn't have those personal resources, but you're not really in a position where you want to bring your family in on the conversation, having that accessibility of someone at school is really important, because it can be done, in your own time, obviously within realms of consent and appropriate contact and all that kind of stuff. It can be just, discreet and private, and young people can access that support. We know accessibility is a barrier. We know that stigma is a barrier as well. And again, as I said before, trying to educate the people that I interact with about the diversity of what someone who is trained in psychology can offer. Outside of that, you've got to be crazy to go see a psychologist, or I'm not nuts enough, or whatever it is that people say. To say, well, actually, psychologists are out there doing all sorts of things. We run one of the things I love is we have whole workshop days with every year level, and they get 1 day a term where they all come together as a year level, and they do lots of activities together and get to know each other and learn about issues. And I love working on those days. And one that I've put together for our year 7s is all about just connecting. It's all about just getting to know each other. And when I kicked off the day with the year 7s a couple of weeks ago and talked to them about, what do you think I'm here for? And they said, you help with problems. I know, well, I'm here because I know that having a good connection with your peers can help you feel good and maybe not have those problems that we talked about. And that's, educating the kids. And they see us everywhere. We're in assemblies, we're going on camp next term, we're, in and out of classes, we're in the playground. And so saying hello to you, understanding who you are, getting a sense of who you are, it breaks down some of that stigma around help seeking and this idea that you have to be really unwell before you ask for help.
What's even more scary, Sally, is that, we've just touched on that one side, which is the students having access and connecting and being able to, meet that psychological, emotional, need at that time. But when we stretch so far, we don't get to do, the other extremely important thing, which is, the policies and procedures, that are so important, and change the dynamic of a school, the, designing curriculum, which is, something that we could immensely, inject, value in professional development for, teachers, administrators, principals, you name it, workshops for students, all that other level stuff, not just the one-on-one. There is so much we can do. And as you say, just the resources of floating around the school, so that
Yeah.
you are a part of the school, that you
Yeah.
are, you're not a unit.
Mm-hmm.
You are a part of it, a part of that family, of that safety network. And
Yeah.
even that brings about safety. There's just the safety net of just saying, I know Sally's there
Yeah.
because I can see her.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And look, you're right. Sometimes, at different times, you get a new referral every couple of days, and each name that comes across the desk, you've got to, work out which of us has the capacity to take on this student. What do they need? Do they need it from us? Do they need it from someone else? All that. And there are times where, a lot of those other things that are so important do seem like, they can get pushed off to the sides. I find sort of having some discipline to kind of remind myself that to prioritise those things really does help. And also to look at, what is it that the students need from us that's reasonable to access in school? How long, like what kind of longevity is reasonable to hold a student for? Because if what they need is ongoing therapeutic intervention, that's for outside of school. And so, we don't sort of, you take them all on, but you move them all through, but you're still there. And it's funny because I work with master students and doing a lot of that sort of training there, and we often have conversations about terminating and appointment. How do we terminate with a client? And in a private practice, it's quite a final sort of like, this is it, we're finishing up, we're moving on. But in school, it always ends with, but if you need me, I'm just here. And so in some ways, the termination happens when they finish year 12. And you know what, even then, sometimes I'll reach out after they've finished. But it's sort of, you're always part of that because you're part of their world. And I'm mindful of that with our year 12s when they start to get ready to go, is, move them on to the next phase, because I'm not at uni. You can't just pop in and see me. You need these skills to be able to manage yourself. So, being able to leave space in your day for these important things, schedule time to make sure that you are attending to these things, you are able to be available to go into a classroom for a lesson and that, help out. I think it's just really important that we as practitioners in schools remember that is part of why we're here. And, really important to prioritise that.
I can also see even a greater importance if a clinician were in one of those larger schools. You spoke about burnout earlier, and I can imagine with a workload, that is much higher than the 800 with say 1.5 psychologists. It must be really difficult to prioritise if in some sense some of those priorities are already designed for you, because if there's a large enough population, say 2,500, and there are safety concerns, you have to drop everything. And your priorities are completely out, and that might be a less common occurrence, but with a 2,500 workload, it could be fairly common. So it's not like you can kind of say, oh, that's a one-off this week, and I can now get back to it's. There's lots of those items. I'm assuming, and I'm sort of speaking probably a bit outside of my depth there, but is that does that tend to be the case once it goes over that 500?
I think
that magic number.
And look, I've been quite fortunate in that I've worked in schools where the ratios are reasonably good. So when I worked in that school, 2,500 students, there were 5 psychologists working in that school.
Wow, that's great.
And which was actually, it was fantastic, because we had a real team, we had a real collegiate team, but we also at times were a silo. We were geographically sort of stuck off on one end of the building of the school. But, that sort of, we tended to sort of stick with each other in, break times and that kind of thing, because we had each other. And, so the capacity for implementing meaningful change was sort of, I guess impaired in some way, because people often just forgot that we were there with stuff to contribute. And that's one of the things that, why it can be really satisfying when you are working in a school, is that you get to be part of the broader solutions if you're in a school that understands what you can contribute and is welcoming and invites that contribution. I know I've had friends who've worked in roles where they go in to schools, delivering under the Better Access. So, student gets a mental health care plan, and the psychologist comes to school to see them, but they're doing, however many sessions in a day, and part of their role is not to pop into assembly, and it's not to go into a staff briefing. That's not what they're paid to do. And people I know who've gone from a school role where they're employed by the school, and then they've gone into that just delivering individual services like that, they can find it really unsatisfying, because they think, well, I can't affect change anywhere. I can see that these students are presenting and they're having an issue, and this thing probably really needs attention within the school, but I can't access that. Whereas when you work in the school, you can go to the person and say, hey, just something I want to run past you. I'm hearing a bit of it, and you can do that when you work in the school environment. But you have to have people who are receptive to it. You've got to be able to deliver it in a way, obviously, that's palatable, because sometimes we have to bring up things that people don't really want to hear. Sure. But, I think we've got good skills in being able to do that. So,
but there's great power or opportunity is a better word to be part of the system, that you have access for change. And it could be just as easy as, rubbing shoulders with a staff member and kind of saying, hey, this has come about. It might not even be directly about a particular student, but you can still drop some gems and get someone to consider how they might be conducting their class, or whatever it might be, or maybe the executives, how those decisions are being made around, I don't know, what students are being asked to do.
No, it makes it satisfying.
Don't want to get too controversial, so to speak, and I'm not trying to do a one versus the other, one's better, one's worse, but you did mention that sometimes there is a difference between an independent school and I suppose a public school. These are such hot topics. These are topics you're not allowed to talk about in a dinner table, or everyone has to be really kind of conscious about how they speak.
Sure.
But it seems to me like there are differences. I don't know if there's anything quantitative out there, or what's out there. But I suppose, and I don't know what your experience is, but are there differences, and not gauging that one is better or worse, because I think there are major pros and cons in both. And I've heard plenty of parents talk about, my child was at a public school, they went over to an independent, or my child was in an independent, they went over to a public, and their world changed. It almost seems like, it's what fits for our kids. But are there general differences or some differences?
Look, we have, any school's going to have students move in and out over the time. And we do have some students who transfer to us from government schools, and we have some students who leave us to go to government schools. I think at the end, look, it's a bit sort of stereotypical, but it's horses for courses. It depends on, the right fit for the child. And that's hard, because we don't always know what that right fit is going to be, when you choose a school. And I'm always conscious. I talk to my, I've got a lot of psychology friends who are parents as well, and we talk about, that concept that we're institutionalized. We went to school, we went to uni, and then we've come back to school. And so we know how schools work in a way that a lot of people don't, if they haven't been engaged in schooling and education since they finished themselves. So I think, in terms of resources, some government schools do amazing things on a shoestring. And I'm sure there are some independent schools who have great resources, but they don't spend it in ways that are always beneficial for students. And look, every school is going to have its own pros and cons, and there are kids in every school who are really, really happy to be there, and there are kids in every school who hate it. I think it's really about, just that fit. It's not that you'll necessarily get a better education at a private school just because you've paid a whole lot of money for it. But then it doesn't mean you'll get a rubbish education at a public school. It really is about what suits the child. And a lot of the time, and this is where we work in the schools, about, that idea of finding that space for flourishing. And if we're going to find that space for good mental health and for flourishing, we need to think about what are the things that can create poor mental health and struggle in a school. And for some students, it's a learning difficulty. And, we can work with teachers about supporting that student to access their learning and show what they're capable of. It might be social connections, so to be able to work with students to find those connections and to feel that sense of belonging. If you feel like you belong in your school, whatever school it is, and look, a friend of mine, Kellyanne Allen, does a lot of work in school belonging. She runs the Belonging Lab at Monash University, and she's doing research all around the world around school belonging. I'm quite lucky I get to mark some of her thesis, students' theses, and I'm learning so much about, school belonging in Iran and India and, all that stuff. But basically, this universal thing that if you feel like you belong at your school, you will do well. And if you're going to feel like you belong, it's usually because you've got good connections with your teachers and you feel like there's people there who get you. And that can happen in any school.
Sally, how beautifully well said, I must say. And I wish I could steal you to put at so many dinner tables when these conversations happen with parents, because it's such a hot topic and it's so controversial. And I think people also get stuck on, their love of their child and therefore fused with this model will be the best for my child because of X, when I think you so beautifully said it, and not in a diplomatic way, but in a way that talks to the needs of the child, and that is so independent of what our parents want, but rather what a child needs, and that belonging is just immense. And I think I hope a lot of people, particularly parents, are able to hear this recording, because I think you're right. We're so blind to all of this. My children have only just started to enter schooling, and my schooling ended in 1996. At least the schooling that I'm talking about for my children. Well, actually earlier than that, because they're only doing primary school, right? So really, if I go back, there's 992. I imagine things have moved, and I scratch my head because the teachers are, they send us letters and emails, and they, when we go in and have conversations, or actually they're readily available to talk to all the time, and it is just. I'm actually so impressed with our education system. It is far superior. Not that I probably saw it with the same eyes as a student. I wasn't very studious, but I think the way that you've expressed that is beautiful. It really is, because it's trying to actually keep the child central rather than us assuming things about our child. And it gives this scope of, it's actually finding an independent school or a government school that fits your child, period. It's not one or the other. It's actually a school in either that fits your child, where they feel they belong and they can have an enriching environment for them, whether it's educational or, more importantly, I would say, is socially and emotionally.
Absolutely. Because all the good educational outcomes happen when you've taken care of that. And if we've got students who feel that they're connected, they're accepted, that they're acknowledged and validated, so many good things come from that. even for the students who do have those challenges, they might have learning challenges, they might have neurodevelopmental challenges, they can still, every single year I see year 12 students graduating, who have just had the most amazing time despite, they come up at year 12 and you think, oh, wow, we got you there. And, every year I usually have one or two students who are on the autism spectrum who come to me towards the end of year 12 and say, I don't want to go, it's too good here, I don't want to leave. And I just, you're helping them sort of get ready to become adults, but it reminds you about what a safe and nurturing environment a school can be. You've got just as many who cannot wait to get out of here, but just to know that we're able to, school doesn't have to be a nightmare. And I think anyone who knows people our age and older who had learning challenges at school, and they will tell you, I hated school. It was awful. It was, the teachers were horrible. No one understood me. They just said I was dumb. I've now been diagnosed. I've got dyslexia. I've got ADHD, whatever it is as an adult. And we're listening to those voices now, like, okay, well, tell us what to do better. What's better than what you had? A lot of parents, adults who are diagnosed with some of those conditions, it's actually when their child is, and they go along to the paediatrician or a psychologist like us, and the psychologist is giving, a formulation for a diagnosis. The parent's like, hang on a minute, I know exactly what this is like. And so, what we're learning from those experiences when it wasn't a safe environment for a young person with autism, with learning difficulty, and we're trying to make schools those safe, inclusive environments for those people. And I think, generally schools do an excellent job at that.
It's incredible. I know that we get letters from our daughter's school that ask all sorts of questions about our daughters, and I don't know, maybe I haven't had enough faith, or maybe I just haven't even thought about it enough, but you answer all these questions that relate to their family home, who's involved with the child, what their interests are, what their strengths are, what their challenges are, whether they've got siblings, you name it. It's all being sort of put out there, and I assume that stuff is used not just to put on a child's record, but so whether it might inform education policy, whether it might inform the school and what they need to do, whether it's to catch some red flags that would be good for early intervention. It's probably used for lots of different things, but you can see schools, especially the idea of educational and developmental psychs. I'm assuming involved in this to go out and find these kids that may benefit from a little bit of let's just call it love, early on to foster an environment or a little plan or even just emotional, connection to say you're safe here. That means we don't have to do very much for the remaining years. It's I can see some real value, particularly in the schools and trying to bolster that, because if we're going to try and address adult mental health situations, and this is not news to anyone, but the best way we can do that, I think, is to invest in our schools, but not just one-on-one therapy. It's all these other things, the leveraging, for example. Let's do workshops, not annually, several annually. It's kind of like, I know that there are schools that do I think they call them there's different acronyms, but it'll be things like classes on values and morals, or another one's called RAVE. I think it's religious education and values, something, right? All these great concepts that I don't remember I had any of those. The best we had was one class on sex ed with the science teacher that pulled out a banana or something. We all giggled. And that was
the condom on the banana.
I don't remember emotions. I don't remember feelings. I don't remember anything being discussed. It was, that was our little highlight. We'd all joke and laugh, and that was kind of it. And that was, in some sense, how we were being prepared.
Yeah, but even when you look at, say like our child safe standards, and the standards that schools and organisations that work with children have to abide by, and one of those standards is all about engaging student voice. And that's actually there in a set, guidelines for organisations working with children, is that you have to be talking to the kids about this stuff. One way that we're looking at doing that at the moment is we've got a suite of policies that cover child protection, child safety, codes of conduct, and that kind of thing. How do we then take these policies and deliver the right elements of it at an age appropriate level to our children, to be able to say to the kids, this is how you ought to be treated, and if you're not being treated like this is what you could do, and you have rights, and to be treated in this way, and this is who you can talk to, and this is how you can say it. And getting ready to sort of support our junior school staff with some protective behaviours interventions, so getting in there and into the classrooms and helping with some of that stuff around those protective behaviours and building that culture of consent and respect and all that kind of thing. We grew up with "because I said so," and just, and that was, the emphasis on compliance at all times that shut down voices of students and of children who were being treated appallingly, but who had learned that, no, you need to be quiet, you speak when you're spoken to, and all that kind of thing. And now we're really empowering our young people to stand up and say, that's not okay, I don't like that, I don't feel safe. It's a massive shift.
What do you see from your perspective in terms of how we're preparing our young generation for the future? And there's this kind of traditional talk that might potentially say that kids are not resilient enough, and I'm not sure whether there's merit in that, or whether that's just old people talking. Is it are we preparing them exceptionally well now in comparison because of these nuanced conversations, and the fact that these are even topics that once we're not? Like, how do you see it? Obviously, as a human, first of all, you've gone through your own schooling, as a educational and developmental psychologist, with your experience. I'm not sure if you've got kids yourself.
I do, yes.
How do you see that space? Because it's a common thing that we hear. Young people, they're entitled, they're not resilient. All these throwaway lines.
Yeah.
Is there any merit in any of that?
Oh, look, I'm a big believer in, for most children, most of the time, especially in that early childhood phase, resilience is their default setting, because you're trying to learn to walk. If you don't keep getting up, you never walk. And, do we start to, I don't know, like, do children become less resilient, or do we expect different things that resilience is going to look like over time? And also, are we equipping young people now with skills to express how they feel in a way that maybe no one said they were struggling before, and now they're struggling? I'm having sort of side issue, but I'm having a conversation with an older man once, a volunteer job I was doing, and he was said something along the lines of, everybody gets so offended nowadays. I said, you know what, mate? Everyone's always been offended. It's just now they're saying something about it. And he went, I've never thought about it like that. And it was in that context around, the way that women get treated by men and the objectification that we're subjected to and all that kind of thing. And now we're encouraging women and our young girls to stand up and say that's actually not acceptable, and I'm not going to put up with that. Now, that doesn't mean that there's more of it going on. It's just more people are saying, nah. And I think if we take that back to what we're seeing with young people and some of those elements of distress, obviously there is increased rates of mental health difficulties. Is it because we're recognising it better? Is it because there's more of it? How do you know? You just don't know. But I think that if we impart a belief in a young person's resilience, they'll often show it to us. But if we see them struggling and their struggle makes us uncomfortable, and I'm talking about this from a parenting perspective, if your child being distressed distresses you and you're then motivated to rid that child of distress, they're never going to learn how to sit with it until it passes. And so a lot of the work that we do with the parents is around that distress tolerance of your child's distress because it's upsetting you.
Mm.
Because, when you are charged with responsibility for this young person and the way things are going to turn out for them, it can be incredibly anxiety provoking. And to that's why like I said before, some of that psychoeducation we do is with the students directly, but it's also the psychoeducation with their parents as well, and normalising some of those things and reminding them that your child's going through an enormous developmental task right now, and yes, it's going to make them really moody and it's going to make them really self-focused, and you'll be okay, Mum, you'll be okay, Dad. And I have to remind that I've got a very emotional 11, nearly 12-year-old, and I have to keep reminding myself these things too. Like, he will be okay. He just gets really emotional. There's nothing wrong. We're sort of talking to students today, actually earlier today, about this concept that, and I've done a bit of training in ACT. It's a modality that I really like with young people. That concept that you can be upset and okay simultaneously. That one doesn't cancel out the other. And I think that some of that resilience comes with being able to step back out of your own emotional experience, respect it, but not be caught in it. But if we can give that expectation that they can cope, they usually do. Sometimes they need more scaffolding, they need more strategies, but I don't know. Are they all falling to pieces? I don't know.
And maybe the idea of this word resilience is for some people talking about putting up, and there's even a question of should we put up with conditions that are not reasonable, and maybe in the past people have put up with things that are not reasonable, and maybe we're a little bit more vocal. It doesn't mean we're not resilient. No. Maybe we're just more vocal in saying this isn't okay. I'm not willing to participate in something or stand by and do nothing because you say so. Maybe I'm willing, and so maybe there's a different space. I just know that it's so often that language is so often, or that terminology, that phrasing is often so used so much that we're not resilient enough, or young people are not resilient enough, and I'd like to think when I was a young person, gosh, if I looked at what I was able to manage, what upset me and how infuriated I got, and how I coped with unfairness and all these things, I don't think they were probably too much different to how kids of today do it either. It takes a while to come to accept unfairness, for example, and the question is just unfairness. Is it something to be put up with? Is it reasonable, or is it something that you're going to continue to find in life, or is it an ideal that you're holding that in actual fact is flawed in and of itself?
That's right. And even I think helping young people discover what their personal thresholds are. At what point does this go from, geez, this person's annoying, to I'm feeling quite victimized by this person right now, and what is your personal threshold? What is the limit that you will take it until? And then when it gets to that point, well, then where do you go? We talk to primary school kids around there's a difference between dobbing and asking for help. If someone's, if you want someone to get in trouble, that's when you're dobbing. When you're asking for help, it's because you don't know what else to do and you've tried everything and that idea about sort of, again, saying to a young person, either directly or indirectly, you know what, I think you've actually got some tools to take care of this. Why don't you have a go and then come back to me and let me know how that's gone? I'm here and I care and I understand. And I think that you can probably, give this a try. Because that's one of the things that we were, especially with our adolescents as well, is that sense of empowerment, feeling empowered that they can make a meaningful difference for themselves, for their world around them. And part of that empowerment is that we accept the child's knowledge of themselves. For young people to be told when they're upset, don't be silly, you're carrying on, you shouldn't think that, you shouldn't feel that. it's really a hard thing when you're grappling with big feelings for the first time and someone tells you that you actually don't really have a right to that feeling. Well, how on earth do you learn how to process it, deal with it, if you're being told it shouldn't even be there?
It's interesting because so much of this is context driven, and as whether it be as parents or as psychologists or educators, trying to, as adults, give context to how do I intervene or what do I say in this scenario that assists a young person, whether it's to try and help them package their emotions a little bit better, whether it's conceptually getting them to see a different perspective, whether it's sitting with discomfort and just being validating. So many possible things to do, but it all comes in the space of context, what might be needed. And I suppose that sings true back to our earlier conversation about having the resources, having the time to actually be considered and think through what's going to be beneficial, whether it's policies and procedures, whether it's workshops, whether it's PD, or whether it's, one-on-one counselling or engaging the parents. So much of this, needs to be, conscious, deliberate, well thought out, clinically considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when we bring our intentionality to that, we model that for the people that we work with. I think that's really important. Yeah.
What are your hopes, being on the inside, so to speak, what are your hopes for education? Where are the, top few places that you could see we could, improve on if we had a meeting with, the education minister and we could kind of, spend a week talking to them and roundtabling, what would be some of the primary things that you think would go a long way for, the big picture, the minister's making kind of global, big, large, clunky, funding arrangements and so on. Where do we put this? What do we do?
I gotta look after your teachers. They carry a lot. They carry so much. They carry, that a curriculum to deliver, students to monitor, parents to respond to, and and they just work so hard. Staff wellbeing is something that I'm also quite passionate about. Making sure that teachers feel that they're able to do what is expected of them, that they feel acknowledged for what they do. That's the dinner part. That's the other part to the dinner party conversation about, teachers getting their holidays and all that kind of stuff. I mean, unless you see it with your own eyes, it's sometimes a bit hard. Although I think that the pandemic and remote learning has opened a number of parents' eyes to what the teachers actually do go through and what they do contribute. So I think first and foremost, we need to look after our teachers. We need to, look at retaining quality staff, but also encouraging teaching as a profession of choice and getting people coming through that, will really, both benefit themselves professionally from working in schools, but then it always flows down to the students. Teachers who love their work are the ones that the kids will remember. Teachers who are stressed and cranky and withdrawn, they're the ones who the kids pick up on that, and guess whose classes they play up in, and then that makes the teacher more stressed and more cranky. So I think, really we need to look at our workforce first and foremost. And I think, like, as I said, I am biased, but I think having psychologists employed in schools should be a priority, partly because of, what we can sort of deliver to take the pressure off those community organisations, but also what we can offer in terms of that global approach to prevention. I know that, in Victoria, the government schools have, the SSS, student support services officers who service, any number of schools, but some of those bigger government schools are now using resources to employ their own welfare teams, and they might be psychologists there, counsellors, social workers, nurses, whatever. I think, giving schools those resources to be able to put those things in place is also, really, really important.
It's almost an extension on looking after the teachers, right? That the psychologist could be, like a teacher's aide, not in the sense of in the room, but outside of the room, to support how they might develop curriculum or how they can support students with behavioural challenges, difficulties, learning difficulties, disorders, how to look after themselves, because they are effectively the sort of surrogate parents, aren't they?
Well, that's the thing, it's in loco parentis. That's like you are acting as the parent when you're at the school. And I think, for us to be able to support teachers, that's one of the things that's the beauty of having an ed and dev on staff, is that because we do have that in-depth training in learning difficulties and learning disorders, but combining with the mental health side of things, that, we can go to a teacher and help them understand why this child who has this diagnosed learning difficulty or this developmental disorder, why that means you're seeing this behaviour, and what are reasonable expectations to have of the student, but also as yourself as a teacher. If you've got a child who's got, severe ADHD and they're not medicated yet, and you think that you should be able to help them focus, it's not that easy. And so sometimes for us to be able to take that knowledge that we have of these conditions and of these difficulties and help the teachers understand what that looks like functionally in the classroom, help them keep those expectations of themselves and of the students within what's reasonable, and then offer support for strategies and that kind of thing. I think that's a really important role that we play, both for the students that we work with individually and those that we don't.
We're almost going back to that conversation of how do you fix our health system, and it's nursing. Let's have more people on the ground who do that physical, hour to hour, minute to minute care. And it doesn't mean that there aren't incredible doctors and consultants who come in, and they almost work on data, don't they? They send out pathology, they look at the pathology, they recommend the next test, and they, in many ways, they often don't even necessarily need to see patients in many conditions, because they're data driven, and so they should be. The evidence base is there, but therefore, it means that the lifeblood of the hospital is, in actual fact, the administrators and the nursing, who get it all done while the doctor does their rounds twice a day. And I'm certainly not taking anything away from the doctors. They're incredible and brilliant. I think the whole package is. But if we're going to talk about the lifeblood of a school, schools are full of teachers. That's the primary staff, right? And if you're going to look after kids, you've got to look after the school, which is the staff. And how do you do that? With more psychologists, is at least one tool. But administrative and all the other aspects as well. It's beautiful that you say that so easily and swiftly. That's what comes to mind, because it just rings so true the moment you said it.
I think education is such a central part of our community, and that's one thing that I'm sort of mindful of, that schools can be sometimes a one-stop shop for all of your community and social needs. So working in with those referral networks is really important, and making sure that that school is able to, bottom line, deliver its core business, which is education. Sometimes there's criticisms of different, initiatives that come in and different packages and stuff that, teachers are supposed to be delivering this national curriculum, but they also need to be teaching about consent. They need to be able to teach about, all these other sorts of things. Well, hang on, where does this all happen? So being able to engage with agencies that can support that in a school, so that teachers are able to get on with that core business of teaching the kids, but not being sort of disenfranchised from some of those bigger social pictures too, because that we're all humans living in the world together. We all, and it's amazing actually. Sometimes we'll get speakers in to come and talk to the students, and so often, about a range of different issues, and so often it's staff come to us afterwards and go, I just got so much out of that, because it resonates for them too, because they are just, humans in the world.
Yeah. Let's professional development for the teachers, because they are doing so much of the parenting, really. Sally, I could talk to you for forget hours. I think for months, and hopefully solve the world's problems. I think we've done some of that today, at least in education. But I think there's some real genuine takeaways in all of what you've said, and I just want to thank you as well for taking the time. And I think in some way, being in your own way an ambassador for educational developmental psychs. I think there's a lot for us to do as psychologists, and in particular in your stream. It's ground roots sort of intervention, and I think we've got to go out and fund that aspect as much as we do, with the teachers, because it all works together. And I just hope we can continue to have voices like yours that are talking to those above, so to speak, or decision makers, and also acknowledging they're actually genuinely trying to do the best thing, and when they do have ideas, it's always hard to figure out how does it actually play out on the ground. But it seems to me that the education system is far superior than it was when I was going through. Maybe not far superior is not fair, because it doesn't mean that anyone do it wrong, but I just think it's more nuanced and it's more considered, because maybe we're just in a different time of history, so we can. But those teachers and schools did a fabulous job as well. But I think there's a lot to be hopeful for. But at the same time, we've identified some areas to examine and explore, which hopefully, if that conversation continues on, it keeps informing. How do we do this better? That we've got a good product, but let's aim for an excellent product. Yeah, for sure. Great. Thank you again, Sally, and all the best. And I'll have to come and meet you for a coffee next time in Melbourne. Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Nesh. Take care. Okay, thank you. If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.